Homeless dog finds family with sick boy. What happens next will change everything. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The park was quiet in the early morning light, a place where most people only pass through on their way to somewhere else. The swings sat still, creaking slightly in the breeze, and the benches were empty, save for the occasional squirrel darting across them. To the stray dog watching from the shadows, the world felt cold and empty. The dog, a thin, scrappy creature with patches of mud caked to its fur, limped toward the edge of a picnic table, its nose twitching. It had smelled food earlier, a faint, tempting scent carried on the wind. Now it sniffed at a discarded paper bag, hoping for crumbs. Its ribs pressed against its skin, each breath slow and shallow. Hunger had become a constant companion, as familiar as the ache in its legs and the dull throb of loneliness in its heart. Buddy, or at least that's what he would later be called, had been alone for longer than he could remember. The streets were unforgiving, and the days blurred together into one endless search for scraps. Sometimes people would yell at him to go away. Sometimes they'd throw things. But Buddy never stayed angry. Anger required energy, and he had little of that left. Today, though, something was different. Buddy's ears perked up as he caught a new sound, a soft giggle that floated across the park like music. He turned his head, his brown eyes narrowing as he watched a little boy lying on a colorful blanket not far from where he hid. The boy's laugh was faint but clear, as though even laughter required effort. Beside the boy sat a woman, probably his mother, with a book in her lap and watchful eyes that darted back and forth between the boy and their surroundings. The boy couldn't have been older than 8, with thin limbs and pale skin that looked almost translucent in the sunlight. His blonde hair stuck up in tufts, as though it hadn't seen a comb that morning. Despite his small frame, the smile on his face was bright, brighter than anything Buddy had seen in a long time. Buddy crouched lower, watching carefully. He didn't like approaching people. They could be unpredictable, and more often than not, they brought trouble. But the smell of food hit him again. Fresh this time, something sweet and soft. His stomach let out a low, rumbling growl, and Buddy flinched at the sound, worried it would give him away. The boy looked up. Their eyes met. For a long moment, Buddy didn't move. He froze in place, his legs tense and ready to run. But the boy didn't yell or wave him off. Instead, his small blue eyes widened, filled with curiosity. Slowly, the boy lifted his arm and reached for something beside him on the blanket. A crust of bread. "Mom," the boy whispered, his voice soft. "Look, a dog." The mother glanced up from her book, her eyes immediately finding Buddy in the shadows. Her body tensed as she grabbed the edge of the blanket instinctively, as though ready to shield her son. "Ethan, don't move," she said gently but firmly. "We don't know if it's safe." The boy, Ethan, didn't take his eyes off Buddy. "I think he's hungry, Mom. Look how skinny he is." The woman frowned, clearly torn. Buddy watched her closely, his instincts ready to flee at the slightest sign of trouble. He had been chased away enough times to know the drill. But then Ethan held out the piece of bread. "Here, boy," Ethan said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's okay. You can have it." Buddy's ears twitched, and his nose flared at the smell of food. His paws inched forward, one slow step at a time, as he emerged from the shadows and into the light. The boy's mother shifted uneasily, but Ethan's smile never wavered. "That's it," Ethan said, his voice full of encouragement. "I won't hurt you." Buddy paused, his gaze flicking back and forth between the boy and the bread. His hunger gnawed at him, but the instinct to run was stronger. People weren't to be trusted. People were dangerous. "Mom, please," Ethan said, turning to her with pleading eyes. He looked so sad. The woman hesitated, her face softening as she glanced at the dog. She still didn't look comfortable, but she sighed and nodded. "Okay, but stay back, Ethan. If he comes close, let him take the food and leave." Ethan beamed and turned back toward Buddy. "See? It's okay now." Buddy took another cautious step forward, then another. His ribs ached, but the promise of food was stronger than the fear. The boy's small hand stayed outstretched, steady despite the effort it seemed to take. When Buddy finally reached the edge of the blanket, he stopped. Up close, the boy smelled different. Not like the sharp, bitter sense of the streets, but like something warm and gentle. His small fingers wiggled slightly, and Buddy sniffed at the bread before snatching it quickly. Ethan laughed, a light, joyful sound that made Buddy pause mid-chew. It wasn't mocking or cruel. It was happy. "You like that, huh?" Ethan said, watching Buddy with bright eyes. Buddy swallowed the bread in one quick gulp, his nose already searching for more. The woman frowned, leaning forward slightly. "Ethan, that's enough. We don't know where he's been." But Ethan wasn't listening. He was still watching Buddy with fascination, as though the stray dog was the most extraordinary thing he'd ever seen. "Can he stay with us, Mom?" Buddy's ears perked up. "Stay?" The woman shook her head quickly. "Ethan, no. That's not safe. He's a stray. He could be sick or dangerous." "He's not dangerous," Ethan insisted, turning back to his mother. "Look at him. He's nice, Mom. I can tell." The woman glanced at Buddy again, her lips pressing into a thin line. Buddy met her gaze, his brown eyes soft and unthreatening. He didn't growl or bark. He simply sat there, watching her, as though waiting for her judgment. After a long pause, she sighed. "Ethan, we can't just take him home. He's not ours." "But he doesn't have anyone," Ethan said quietly, his voice suddenly filled with sadness. "And I don't have anyone either." The woman's expression faltered, her shoulders sagging slightly. She looked at her son, her heart clearly breaking at the words. "You have me," she said softly. "I know," Ethan replied, turning back to Buddy. "But he looks like he needs us. And maybe we need him too." Buddy didn't understand the words, but he felt the weight of them. It was in the boy's voice, in the way his small hand reached out again. Not with food this time, but simply to touch. The woman watched carefully, her eyes flicking between her son and the dog. Finally, she sighed again, though it sounded more like surrender. "Fine, but only for today. He can stay outside on the porch while we figure out what to do with him." Ethan's face lit up. "Really? Thank you, Mom." Buddy tilted his head, confused as Ethan turned toward him with the brightest smile yet. "Come on, boy," Ethan said, patting the blanket gently. "You can come with us now." Buddy hesitated, his instincts warring with the strange pull he felt toward the boy. People had never been kind to him before. People had always meant danger. But this boy was different. Tentatively, Buddy took another step forward, then another until he was standing fully on the edge of the blanket. Ethan's mother tensed, ready to pull her son back, but Buddy did nothing more than sit down, his thin frame sinking into the grass as he watched the boy with quiet curiosity. Ethan's grin widened, and he clapped his hands softly. "See? He's a good boy. I told you." The woman still looked uneasy, but she didn't argue. She simply gathered up the blanket and helped Ethan to his feet. Buddy watched as they packed up their things, his ears flicking back and forth as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Then Ethan turned and patted his leg, motioning for Buddy to follow. "Come on, boy," he said again, his voice soft but sure. "Let's go home." Home. Buddy didn't know what that word meant. Not really. But something about it made his chest ache in a way he couldn't explain. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet and followed the boy and his mother toward the edge of the park. The sun was warmer now, shining down on the trio as they made their way across the grass. Buddy's steps were slow and careful, but with each one, the world felt a little less cold. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he dared to hope that it might be something good. Buddy followed the boy and his mother with cautious steps as they left the park and made their way toward a quiet neighborhood nearby. The walk felt long, not because of the distance but because of the strangeness of it all. Buddy wasn't used to walking alongside people, especially not people who seemed so gentle. The boy, Ethan, glanced back every few steps, as though checking to make sure Buddy was still there. Each time he looked back, his face would light up with the same excited smile, and Buddy's tail, almost against his will, wagged faintly. The boy's mother stayed quiet, her posture tense as she kept a close eye on the scrappy dog trailing behind them. When they finally reached a small, modest house with chipped paint and an overgrown lawn, Buddy hesitated at the edge of the property. His paws stopped on the cracked sidewalk, his instincts tugging at him to turn back. For as long as he could remember, people's homes had been places to avoid, yards full of barking dogs or angry voices shouting for him to leave. Ethan noticed Buddy's hesitation and turned around, his brows knitting together. "It's okay," he said softly, crouching down and patting his legs. "Come on, boy. This is our house. You're safe here." Buddy's ears flicked forward as he watched the boy carefully. Something about the way Ethan spoke, so soft, so sure, made Buddy take a tentative step forward. Then another. The woman sighed, unlocking the front door as she looked back at the boy and the dog. "Ethan, he can stay on the porch for now. We don't know if he's healthy." Ethan didn't argue, but his smile didn't waver either. "Okay, Mom." He turned back to Buddy and patted the wooden steps leading up to the porch. "See? You can sit right here. It's comfy." Buddy climbed the steps cautiously, his paws creaking against the old wood as he settled onto the porch. It wasn't much, just a shaded corner with a faded welcome mat. But to Buddy, it felt like something close to shelter. Ethan's mother disappeared inside, muttering about calling the vet and finding some food, leaving Ethan to sit cross-legged on the top step, just a few feet from Buddy. The boy leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied the scrappy dog. "What's your name, huh?" Ethan asked, tilting his head. "Do you even have one?" Buddy stared back at the boy, his brown eyes reflecting the curiosity he saw in Ethan's face. "I think I'll call you Buddy," Ethan said suddenly, grinning. "Yeah, that's a good name. You look like a buddy." The dog's ears perked up slightly at the sound of his new name, and Ethan giggled. "See? You like it." For the first time in a long time, Buddy felt something he didn't quite recognize. A small flicker of warmth that settled deep in his chest. It wasn't food or shelter, but it was something close. Ethan sat with Buddy for what felt like hours, talking to him as though the scrappy dog could understand every word. He told Buddy about his favorite toys, his favorite cartoons, and how much he loved peanut butter sandwiches. He even told Buddy about the stars, pointing up at the sky as though the day hadn't yet given way to night. Buddy didn't understand the words, but he understood the boy. Ethan's voice carried something soothing, something kind, and Buddy found himself relaxing for the first time in years. That night, Buddy stayed on the porch as the house grew quiet. A small blanket had been laid out for him, a gesture that made Buddy pause as he curled up on the soft fabric. He hadn't had anything like this in so long that he barely knew what to do with it. He stayed awake for a while, his ears flicking at the faint sounds of crickets in the yard and the occasional hum of a car passing by. From inside the house, he could hear the faint, steady breathing of people asleep. It was a comforting sound. Safe. But safety was a foreign thing for Buddy. He kept his nose tucked under his tail, his body tense even as exhaustion began to pull at him. The streets had taught him that safety was an illusion, that kindness often came with strings attached. Still, as he listened to the soft creaks of the old house, Buddy felt something new, the slightest hint of belonging. The next morning, Buddy was woken by the sound of the front door creaking open. His eyes flew open as his head shot up, his body ready to run. But instead of danger, Buddy found Ethan standing there in his pajamas, holding a small plate with slices of scrambled egg. "Morning, Buddy," the boy said brightly, sitting down on the top step of the porch. "I brought you breakfast. Mom says you need to eat." Buddy sniffed the air cautiously, his nose twitching as the smell of eggs hit him. He glanced up at Ethan and then at the plate, unsure if this was some kind of trick. "It's okay," Ethan said, pushing the plate closer. "You can have it. It's all yours." Buddy hesitated only a moment longer before inching forward and lapping up the food. It was warm, soft, and delicious, better than anything he'd had in ages. Ethan beamed as he watched the scrappy dog devour every last bite. "You were really hungry, huh?" Buddy licked the plate clean before glancing up at the boy again, his tail wagging faintly. Ethan's face lit up at the sight, his small hands clapping together. "Mom, he likes it." From somewhere inside the house, Ethan's mother called back. "That's good, honey. Just make sure you wash your hands after." Ethan giggled and reached out cautiously toward Buddy. "Can I pet you, Buddy? Is that okay?" Buddy froze, his body stiffening instinctively. Hands were something he knew to avoid. Too often, they brought pain instead of comfort. But Ethan's hand stayed outstretched, small and steady, waiting patiently. "It's okay," Ethan whispered. "I won't hurt you." Buddy's nose twitched as he sniffed at Ethan's fingers. The boys scent gentle and familiar. Slowly, carefully, Buddy leaned forward and nudged his head under Ethan's hand. The boy let out a delighted laugh as he ran his fingers gently over Buddy's muddy fur, careful not to press too hard. "You're a good boy, Buddy. I knew it." Buddy's tail wagged again, this time more freely, and Ethan grinned as though the dog's trust was the greatest gift he'd ever received. As the days passed, Buddy began to settle into his new life. He spent his mornings on the porch, basking in the sunlight while Ethan sat beside him, telling him stories about cartoons, superheroes, and the adventures he dreamed of having. In the afternoons, Ethan's mother would carefully carry a bowl of food out to Buddy, always with a cautious eye, though her wariness seemed to fade a little more each day. "Your name suits you," she said one afternoon, watching as Buddy wagged his tail at the sight of his food. "You're turning out to be quite the buddy for Ethan." Buddy didn't understand her words, but her voice was softer now, less guarded. He still kept his distance when she moved too close, but even so, the tension in his body began to fade. Ethan's bond with Buddy grew stronger with every day. The boy would curl up with a blanket on the porch, reading aloud from picture books while Buddy listened intently, as though every word mattered. Ethan's giggles, once so rare, now filled the air regularly, carried on the wind like little bursts of joy. And for the first time in a long time, Buddy felt something he had almost forgotten existed: love. But it wasn't all easy. Some days were harder than others, especially for Ethan. Buddy began to notice the boy's coughing fits that would sometimes shake his small body, leaving him breathless and pale. He noticed how tired Ethan looked some mornings, how his mother would carry him back inside when the sun became too much. On those days, Buddy would sit quietly at the front door, his ears perked up as he listened for any sounds from inside the house. He didn't understand what was wrong, but he knew Ethan wasn't like the other children he'd seen running through the park. Ethan was fragile, and that scared Buddy more than anything. And so Buddy stayed. He stayed when Ethan was strong and laughing, and he stayed when Ethan was weak and quiet. Because that's what friends did. That's what family did. The days turned into weeks, and life began to settle into a quiet rhythm. Buddy was no longer just a stray dog on the porch. He was Buddy, Ethan's dog, Ethan's friend. The house, which had once felt so empty and quiet, now hummed with the sounds of life: Ethan's laughter, Buddy's soft tail thumps against the floorboards, and the occasional scolding from Ethan's mother when Buddy tracked mud into the house. "Buddy," she'd call out, exasperated but never angry. "At least try to stay clean." Ethan would always giggle, clutching his small stomach, while Buddy wagged his tail sheepishly. It was as though Buddy knew that even her words, no matter how stern they tried to sound, were softened by something deeper: acceptance. Ethan was thriving in ways his mother hadn't seen in years. She couldn't deny it. Buddy had brought something to her son's life that no medicine, no doctor's appointment, and no well-intentioned distraction ever could. Ethan smiled more, laughed more, and the light in his eyes seemed to grow brighter each day. Even the neighbors began to notice. One afternoon, Mrs. Sanders from 2 doors down caught sight of Ethan and Buddy playing in the small front yard. She paused on her walk, leaning on her cane as she watched. Ethan was sitting in the grass, throwing a small rubber ball for Buddy to chase. The dog, despite his still scrappy appearance, bounded after the ball with the enthusiasm of a puppy, his tail wagging wildly. "Looks like you've got yourself a new best friend," Mrs. Sanders called out, her voice warm. Ethan looked up, beaming. "This is Buddy. He's my dog now. Buddy trotted back to Ethan, the ball clutched in his teeth, before dropping it gently into the boy's lap. Well, Buddy's lucky to have you, Mrs. Sanders said, smiling. You take good care of each other, you hear? We will, Ethan replied, reaching out to ruffle Buddy's ears. Right, Buddy? Buddy leaned into Ethan's touch, his eyes half closed with contentment. Mrs. Sanders continued on her way, leaving Ethan and Buddy to their game. From inside the house, Ethan's mother watched through the window, a faint smile on her face. She had worried, in the beginning, that Buddy would be too much. A stray dog with an unknown past, a risk she couldn't afford to take with her son's fragile health. But watching them now, seeing the joy Buddy brought to Ethan's life, she realized how wrong she had been. Sometimes, the things you feared most turned out to be the things you needed the most. One night, after an especially tiring day, Ethan lay curled up on the couch with Buddy stretched out beside him. The TV played softly in the background, but Ethan wasn't watching. His small fingers gently traced the fur on Buddy's back, his breathing slow and steady. "Mom," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's mother looked up from where she sat at the kitchen table, sorting through bills. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Buddy was alone for a long time?" She glanced toward the dog, who lay with his head resting on his paws, his eyes half open as though listening. "Maybe," she said gently, "but he's not alone anymore." Ethan smiled faintly, resting his cheek against Buddy's side. "I think he needed us, just like we needed him." Ethan's mother felt a lump form in her throat at her son's words. He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, but there was a truth in what he said that hit her hard. Buddy had been lost and alone. Ethan had been sick and lonely. Somehow, in the vastness of the world, the two had found each other, and both of their lives had been changed because of it. She stood quietly and crossed the room, kneeling beside the couch to tuck the blanket more securely around Ethan's small frame. "You're right," she said softly, brushing a hand across his forehead. "Buddy needed us, and we needed him too." Ethan's smile grew a little wider as his eyes fluttered closed. Buddy let out a soft huff, his ears twitching slightly as though in agreement. But life, as always, wasn't without its challenges. One cold night, Buddy woke to the sound of coughing. His head shot up, ears perked as he scanned the darkened room. Ethan was curled up in his bed, his small body trembling as another fit of coughing shook him. Buddy let out a soft whine, hopping off the rug where he had been sleeping. He padded over to the edge of Ethan's bed, resting his chin gently on the mattress as he watched his boy struggle for breath. Ethan's mother rushed in a moment later, her face pale with worry. She sat beside Ethan, rubbing his back as she murmured soft reassurances. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here. Just breathe." Buddy didn't move. He stayed right there, his brown eyes wide and worried, as though he understood that something was very, very wrong. When Ethan's breathing finally calmed, his mother scooped him into her arms, carefully carrying him toward the car. Buddy watched from the doorway, his tail tucked low, as they disappeared into the night. Hours passed, and Buddy stayed awake. He paced the house, his nails clicking against the wooden floor as he sniffed at the door, waiting for them to come back. The quiet of the house felt heavier now, colder. When the door finally creaked open at sunrise, Buddy was there in an instant, his tail wagging faintly as Ethan's mother walked in, carrying Ethan wrapped in a blanket. The boy's face was pale, but he smiled weakly at Buddy, lifting a hand to pat the dog's head. "Hi, Buddy," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse. Buddy licked Ethan's hand gently, his tail thumping against the floor. "He's okay," Ethan's mother said softly, as though reassuring both herself and the dog. "It was just a bad night, but the doctor said he'll be fine." Buddy stayed close to Ethan for the rest of the day, his furry body curled protectively at the boy's side as he rested on the couch. Every time Ethan let out even the smallest cough, Buddy's head would snap up, his eyes watching closely. "You're like my guard dog," Ethan said with a sleepy smile, his hand resting on Buddy's back. "You're keeping me safe, aren't you?" Buddy didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. He leaned into Ethan's touch, his tail wagging faintly. As winter set in, Buddy and Ethan's bond only grew stronger. Ethan spent most of his time indoors now, his health too fragile to play outside for long. But he didn't mind, not as long as Buddy was with him. They spent hours curled up together, watching cartoons or reading books aloud. Ethan would rest his head against Buddy's side, his small fingers absently playing with the dog's fur. And Buddy, for his part, seemed perfectly content. Ethan's mother began to notice something else, too. Something she couldn't explain. Buddy seemed to sense when Ethan was about to have a bad day. On those mornings, Buddy would stay even closer to Ethan than usual, refusing to leave his side. He would nudge Ethan gently, letting out soft, worried whines until the boy's mother came to check on him. "It's like he knows," she told her sister one day over the phone. "He knows before I do when Ethan's not feeling well. It's uncanny. Dogs are smarter than we give them credit for," her sister replied. "Maybe Buddy's just looking out for him." She smiled at the thought, glancing across the room where Ethan was fast asleep on the couch. Buddy curled up protectively beside him, looking out for him. Yes, she thought, that's exactly what Buddy was doing. As the days grew colder and the holidays approached, the little house seemed to hum with warmth, despite the frost clinging to the windows outside. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, decorated with strings of lights and handmade ornaments. Ethan had been the one to hang most of them, with Buddy sitting beside him, watching intently as if trying to understand the excitement. Ethan had even made a special ornament for Buddy, a round, wobbly clay disc with the word Buddy etched into it. It hung proudly on the lowest branch, right where Buddy could see it. Ethan had laughed when Buddy sniffed at the tree, his tail wagging as though he knew something special had been made just for him. "You're part of the family now," Ethan told Buddy one afternoon, curling up beside him on the rug by the fire. "That means you get to celebrate Christmas too." Buddy didn't understand what Christmas was, but he understood Ethan's happiness. He stayed close to the boy, his head resting in Ethan's lap, as the fire crackled and the house filled with the faint scent of baking cookies. Ethan's mother watched them from the doorway, her heart swelling as she took in the sight. Ethan's laughter, so rare before Buddy's arrival, had become a regular sound in their home. She couldn't deny it. Buddy had changed everything. The little dog, who had once been a skinny stray scavenging for scraps, had brought life back into their house. More importantly, he had brought joy back into Ethan's heart. But life, as it often does, was about to test them. It started with a cough. Ethan had been doing well for weeks, better than his mother had seen him in months. He was stronger, happier, and spending more time out of bed. But one morning, as snow dusted the front yard like powdered sugar, Ethan's coughing returned. At first, it was just a small, occasional sound, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the day wore on, the cough grew louder, deeper, until it shook his frail body. By evening, Ethan was curled up on the couch, pale and shivering, his small hands clutching at Buddy's fur as though drawing strength from his presence. Buddy stayed close, his body pressed against Ethan's side as he let out soft, worried whines. Ethan's mother hovered nearby, her face etched with concern. She checked his temperature, smoothed back his hair, and murmured soft reassurances. But Buddy could sense her fear. The tension in the air was thick, heavy, and Buddy didn't like it. "It's okay, Buddy," Ethan whispered, his voice raspy. "I'm okay. You're here." But Buddy knew better. He could feel the boy's trembling, hear the struggle in his breath. Something was wrong. Late that night, when the coughing grew worse, Ethan's mother made the decision to take him to the hospital. She bundled him up carefully, her hands shaking as she pulled a hat over his blonde hair and wrapped him in a blanket. "Stay here, Buddy," she said firmly as the dog stood at the door, his tail low and his ears pulled back. "We'll be back soon." Buddy didn't move as she carried Ethan out the door and into the cold night. He stood there, his brown eyes wide and worried, his body tense as the sound of the car engine faded into the distance. The house was quiet, too quiet. Buddy paced the living room, his nails clicking against the wooden floor as he sniffed at Ethan's blanket on the couch. It still smelled like him, warm and faintly sweet, like the boy who had given Buddy a name, a home, and something to believe in. But now Ethan was gone. Buddy lay down beside the couch, his head resting on the blanket as he let out a low, mournful whine. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the yard in white. But inside, the little house felt cold and empty. Hours turned into a day. Then two. Ethan's mother returned once to grab clothes and essentials, her face pale and her eyes red. Buddy greeted her at the door, his tail wagging faintly as he looked past her, searching for Ethan. "He's still at the hospital, Buddy," she said softly, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. He's very sick." Buddy tilted his head, his brown eyes full of questions she couldn't answer. "I'll bring him home soon," she promised. "I just need you to be patient, okay?" She left again, and Buddy returned to his spot beside the couch, waiting. The house grew quieter with each passing hour. The sounds of laughter and cartoons were gone, replaced by the ticking of the clock and the occasional groan of the old house settling. Buddy rarely moved, except to eat the food Ethan's mother had left for him. Even then, he ate without enthusiasm. His ears perked toward the door as though listening for the sound of the car returning. On the third day, Buddy could wait no longer. The snow had stopped, leaving the world outside blanketed in white, and the sun hung low in the sky. Buddy stood at the front door, his nose pressed against the cold glass as he stared out into the empty yard. Something inside him told him he couldn't wait anymore. Ethan needed him. With a determined huff, Buddy turned and padded to the back door, where the latch was old and worn. He had seen it open before when the wind blew just right, and now, with a little nudge of his nose and a push of his weight, the door creaked open. The cold air hit Buddy like a wave, but he didn't hesitate. He slipped through the door and into the snow, his paws sinking into the cold, powdery surface as he looked out at the empty road ahead. He didn't know where the hospital was. He didn't know how far he would have to go. But Buddy knew one thing. Ethan was out there, and Buddy had to find him. The journey was slow, the snow deep and unforgiving. Buddy's thin frame shivered with every step, his breath visible in the cold air. But he didn't stop. He followed the faint scent of Ethan and his mother that lingered on the ground, his nose guiding him through empty streets and quiet neighborhoods. Cars passed occasionally, their tires crunching through the snow, but no one stopped to notice the scrappy dog trudging determinedly through the cold. Buddy didn't care. He kept moving, his body tired but his spirit strong. By the time night fell, Buddy had made it into the heart of town. The buildings were taller here, the streets louder, but Buddy barely noticed. His nose twitched as he caught a stronger whiff of Ethan's scent, mixed faintly with antiseptic and the strange, cold smell of a place Buddy didn't recognize. The hospital. Buddy's ears perked up as he followed the scent, his paws leaving prints in the snow as he approached the large building with bright lights and automatic doors. People came and went, their faces tired and hurried, but Buddy's focus never wavered. He slipped through the open doors unnoticed, his paws clicking softly against the polished floors. The air smelled strange here, like cleaning chemicals and something he couldn't name, but Ethan's scent was stronger now, guiding him like a beacon. Buddy padded down a long hallway, past rooms filled with beeping machines and hushed voices. A nurse glanced down and gasped softly when she saw him. "Hey, who let this dog in here?" But Buddy didn't stop. "Wait," the nurse called, but Buddy had already turned a corner, his nose leading him closer and closer to the one person he needed to see. And then he found him. Ethan was lying in a small bed, his face pale and his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. His mother sat beside him, her head resting on her folded arms as she slept. Buddy paused in the doorway, his ears flicking as he took in the sight. For a moment he was still, as though afraid to break the quiet. Then he stepped forward, his paws making no sound as he crossed the room and stopped beside the bed. Ethan stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked, his tired gaze landing on the scrappy dog standing at his bedside. "Buddy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Buddy let out a soft whine, resting his chin gently on the edge of the bed as his tail wagged faintly. Ethan's lips curved into a weak smile, his small hand reaching out to touch Buddy's head. "You found me," he murmured. Buddy stayed perfectly still, his brown eyes watching Ethan with a love that needed no words. Ethan's mother woke with a start, her eyes widening when she saw the dog beside the bed. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice breaking, but Buddy didn't move. He stayed right there where he belonged by Ethan's side. Ethan's mother could hardly believe what she was seeing. She blinked several times as though trying to make sense of the scrappy dog standing so still, his chin gently resting on the edge of Ethan's hospital bed. "Buddy," she whispered again, her voice cracking with disbelief. "How on earth did you?" Ethan stirred at the sound of his mother's voice. His eyes, still tired and glassy, opened slightly as his small fingers absently stroked Buddy's head. A soft smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "See, Mom," he murmured. "He came to find me. I told you he's a good boy." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as she took in the sight. Buddy, this stray dog who had wandered into their lives by chance, had somehow made his way through the cold, through the snow, and all the way to the hospital. She had no idea how it was possible, but none of that mattered. He was here. She knelt beside the bed, brushing Ethan's hair back gently as her other hand rested on Buddy's head. "How did you find us, huh?" she whispered to the dog, her voice soft and full of awe. "You really are something special, aren't you?" Buddy let out a soft, contented huff, his tail wagging faintly. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling, the warmth in her voice, the love in Ethan's touch. He had found them, and that was all that mattered. The door to the room creaked open suddenly, and a nurse stepped inside, her eyes widening when she saw Buddy. "What in the world? How did this dog get in here?" Ethan's mother stood quickly, a flash of panic crossing her face. "Wait, please, don't take him away. He's my son's dog." The nurse frowned, clearly skeptical, but her gaze softened when she looked at Ethan. The boy's small hand was still resting on Buddy's head, his breathing calmer now, his face more relaxed than it had been in days. "Please," Ethan's mother repeated, her voice trembling. "He won't cause any trouble. Promise. Just let him stay. My son needs him." The nurse hesitated for a long moment, her expression torn. Finally, she let out a small sigh. "I can't promise the doctors will allow it, but I'll give you some time. Just keep him quiet, okay?" Ethan's mother nodded quickly, relief washing over her. Thank you so much." The nurse glanced at Buddy again before leaving the room, shaking her head as though she couldn't believe what she just agreed to. Ethan's mother turned back to Buddy, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "I don't know how you did it," she said softly, kneeling beside the dog. "But thank you. You're a miracle, Buddy. Truly." Buddy didn't move. He stayed by Ethan's side, his eyes never leaving the boy as though he knew his job wasn't finished yet. For the next few hours, Buddy stayed curled up on a blanket at the foot of Ethan's hospital bed. The nurses who came and went couldn't help but smile when they saw him. It was impossible not to notice the change in Ethan. How his breathing seemed easier, how his restless sleep had become more peaceful with Buddy nearby. Animals have a way of helping, don't they? One nurse murmured to Ethan's mother as she checked Ethan's for. "Sometimes, they know what we need better than we do." Ethan's mother nodded, her gaze fixed on the boy and his dog. "He hasn't smiled like this in weeks," she whispered. She glanced at Buddy, who lifted his head slightly, as if sensing they were talking about him. "I think he saved us both," she added softly. Over the next 2 days, Ethan began to improve. His fever dropped, and the coughing fits that had left him breathless became less frequent. The doctors were amazed by his progress, though they attributed it to a combination of rest and the treatments they'd given him. But Ethan's mother knew better. She knew it wasn't just medicine that had helped her son. It was Buddy. Whenever Ethan woke up, Buddy was there, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Whenever Ethan felt tired or scared, he would reach out for Buddy, his small fingers curling into the dog's fur. And Buddy never moved, never left his side. as though he knew Ethan needed him more than ever. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the hospital window, Ethan turned to his mother with a small smile. "Mom, can Buddy come home with us soon?" She smiled back, brushing a hand over his forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. As soon as you're better, we'll all go home together." Ethan's face lit up at her words. "Promise." "I promise." A week later, Ethan was discharged from the hospital. He was still weak, his body tired from the illness, but his smile was brighter than ever as he sat in the wheelchair, Buddy trotting faithfully beside him. The nurses and staff gathered near the front entrance, watching as Ethan's mother carefully helped him into the car. Buddy hesitated for only a moment before leaping onto the back seat, settling beside Ethan as though he'd always belonged there. As the car pulled away, one of the nurses turned to her colleague with a soft smile. "I don't know who saved who," she said quietly, watching Buddy's head poking out the window as the car disappeared down the road. "But that dog, he's special." When they arrived home, the little house seemed to welcome them back like an old friend. The Christmas tree still stood in the corner, its lights glowing softly as though waiting for Ethan's return. Buddy leapt out of the car and bounded up the porch steps, his tail wagging wildly as Ethan's mother carried the boy inside. Ethan's face lit up as he settled onto the couch, Buddy jumping up beside him without hesitation. "We're home, Buddy," Ethan said softly, resting his head against the dog's side. "We did it," Buddy huffed softly, licking Ethan's hand as his tail thumped against the couch cushion. Ethan's mother stood nearby, watching them with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. She had never believed in miracles before. Not really, but looking at her son and his dog, she realized that sometimes miracles came in the most unexpected forms. A small, scrappy stray dog, a boy who needed a friend, and a bond that had changed everything. The days that followed were filled with warmth and quiet joy. Ethan grew stronger with each passing day, and Buddy never left his side. They spent hours together, curled up in blankets, reading books, or simply watching the snow fall outside the window. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Ethan's mother found the two of them asleep on the couch. Ethan was curled up with his head resting on Buddy's side, his face peaceful, his breathing steady. She paused, taking in the sight. The boy who had once been so fragile, so lonely, now safe and happy, and the dog who had found a family when he needed one most. As tears filled her eyes, she whispered softly, "Thank you, Buddy. You saved him." Buddy's ears flicked slightly at the sound of her voice, though he didn't wake. He simply let out a soft, contented sigh, as though he already knew. The bond between Buddy and Ethan became something of a legend in their small neighborhood. Neighbors who had once passed by without noticing now stopped to admire the scrappy dog with the big heart. "That's Ethan's dog," Mrs. Sanders would say proudly, pointing Buddy out to anyone who asked. "You wouldn't believe the story if I told you," and yet, for all the attention and praise, Buddy remained the same. He stayed by Ethan's side, always watchful, always loyal, just as he had been since the day they met in the park. One evening, as the snow began to fall again, Ethan sat by the window with Buddy at his feet. He watched the flakes drift down from the sky, his fingers absently scratching behind Buddy's ears. "You know what, Buddy?" Ethan said softly, turning to look at the dog. "We saved each other." Buddy lifted his head, his brown eyes meeting Ethan's, as though he understood every word. Ethan smiled, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to the top of Buddy's head. "I love you, Buddy. You're my best friend." Buddy let out a soft huff, his tail wagging slowly as he settled back down with a contented sigh. Outside, the world was quiet, the snow falling like a blanket over the little house. But inside, there was warmth, there was love. And in that moment, neither Ethan nor Buddy felt alone. They had found each other, and that was enough. The snow continued to fall outside, turning the neighborhood into a winter wonderland. From the window, the world looked quiet, soft, and still. But inside the little house, life buzzed with the quiet joy of companionship, of two souls who had found each other against all odds. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between Ethan and Buddy only grew stronger. Wherever Ethan went, Buddy was close behind. If Ethan was curled up in bed, Buddy was lying at his feet. If Ethan was watching TV, Buddy was beside him, his head resting on Ethan's lap. It was as though the dog knew, deep down, that his purpose was to be there, always, to watch over the boy who had given him so much. Ethan's health continued to improve, slowly but steadily. The doctors were optimistic. His mother marveled at his progress, watching as her son grew stronger with each passing day. She knew Buddy was part of the reason. The dog gave Ethan something no medicine ever could: hope, joy, and a reason to keep fighting. One afternoon, Ethan's mother decided it was time to take them both back to the park, the place where everything had begun. Ethan was thrilled at the idea, his blue eyes lighting up like Christmas morning as his mother helped him bundle up in his warmest coat, hat, and scarf. "Are you ready, Buddy?" Ethan asked as he knelt beside the dog, his mittened hands resting gently on Buddy's head. Buddy wagged his tail, letting out a happy huff as though to say, "I'm always ready." Ethan's mother smiled, watching the two of them. "Come on, you two," she said, grabbing the car keys. "Let's go on an adventure." The park looked different now, covered in a thick blanket of snow. The swings hung still, weighed down by frost, and the picnic tables stood empty, their surfaces dusted white. It was quiet, save for the crunch of Ethan's boots as he stepped onto the path. Buddy trotted alongside him, his paws leaving little prints in the snow. His nose twitched as he sniffed the cold air, his tail wagging as though he remembered this place, the place where his life had changed. Ethan stopped at the same spot where they had first met all those weeks ago. He crouched down, his mittened hands digging into the snow to scoop it up. "Remember this, Buddy?" he asked softly, looking up at the dog. "This is where I found you. Or maybe you found me." Buddy sat down beside him, tilting his head as though listening. Ethan's mother watched from a short distance away, her heart full as she took in the scene. Her son, stronger than he had been in months, laughing softly as he played with his best friend. It was a sight she had once thought she might never see again. Ethan packed the snow into a small, lopsided ball and held it up for Buddy to see. "Do you want to play fetch, boy?" Buddy's ears perked up, and he stood, his tail wagging furiously as he barked, a joyful sound that echoed through the quiet park. Ethan laughed, winding up his arm before tossing the snowball gently. It disappeared into the powdery ground a few feet away, but Buddy didn't care. He bounded through the snow, sending flurries into the air as he chased the ball, his enthusiasm contagious. Ethan clapped his hands together, laughing so hard that he stumbled backward into the snow, landing with a soft humph. "Buddy, you're silly." Buddy raced back to him, his paws kicking up snow as he skidded to a stop beside the boy. He nosed at Ethan's coat, letting out a playful bark as if to say, "I got it, I got it." Ethan giggled, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold and the laughter. "You're the best dog ever, Buddy." Buddy huffed, his tail wagging as he settled down beside Ethan, curling himself around the boy as though shielding him from the cold. Ethan's mother smiled through her tears. She had always believed in miracles, not the kind you read about in books or saw in movies, but the quiet kind, like the way Buddy had appeared in their lives exactly when they needed him most. A sick boy and a stray dog, both lost in their own ways, had somehow saved each other. That night, after they returned home, Ethan snuggled into bed with Buddy curled up beside him. The soft glow of the Christmas tree lights spilled through the hallway, casting a warm light across the room. "Mom," Ethan murmured sleepily as she tucked the blanket around him. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Buddy will always stay with me?" Ethan's mother smiled, brushing his hair gently back from his forehead. "I think Buddy will stay with you for as long as you need him," she said softly. "And I think you'll always need each other." Ethan smiled faintly, his hand resting on Buddy's back. "I hope so. He's my best friend." Buddy let out a soft, contented sigh, as though agreeing with every word. Ethan's mother stood quietly for a moment, watching her son drift off to sleep. She thought about all the twists and turns their lives had taken, how hard things had been, how much they'd struggled, and yet, here they were, safe, warm, and together. As she turned off the light and closed the door, she whispered softly, "Thank you, Buddy." The little house grew quiet as the snow fell softly outside. Buddy stayed awake a little longer, his ears flicking at the faint creaks of the house. He watched Ethan, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of the boy's breathing. For Buddy, this was home. The years passed, as years often do, and Ethan grew stronger with each one. He still had challenges. Bad days where he needed rest, hospital visits that left him tired. But he was happy, and Buddy was always there. Buddy aged too. His fur grew grayer around the muzzle, and his steps slowed, but his spirit never changed. Wherever Ethan went, Buddy followed, always at his side. When Ethan turned 12, he gave a speech at a small school assembly about friendship. He stood on the stage, his blue eyes bright, and held up a picture of himself and Buddy, his best friend. "This is Buddy," he said proudly. "We found each other when we both needed help." I think sometimes people think they're saving animals when they adopt them. But really, sometimes the animals save us. The audience clapped, but Ethan didn't hear them. He looked at Buddy, who sat beside him on the stage, wearing a small scarf tied neatly around his neck. Buddy looked up at the boy with his familiar, soft gaze, his tail thumping gently against the floor. Ethan smiled down at him, reaching out to scratch his ears. "Thank you for saving me, Buddy," Buddy huffed, leaning into Ethan's touch. It was a bond that no one else could fully understand. A boy and his dog, two souls that had been lost and found again, together. Years later, when Ethan was grown and the house was quiet once more, he often thought back to that cold winter day in the park. The day a scrappy stray dog had walked into his life and changed everything. Ethan never forgot Buddy. He never forgot the love, the loyalty, or the quiet way Buddy had been there for him, through every struggle, every challenge, every joy. Because Buddy had been more than just a dog. He had been a friend. He had been family. And even when the years passed and life moved on, the memory of Buddy remained, like a light that never went out. Sometimes, when the snow fell softly outside the window, Ethan would sit by the fire, close his eyes, and smile. In his heart, he could still feel Buddy's head resting on his lap, his tail thumping softly against the floor. "Thank you, Buddy," he would whisper, the words carried away on the quiet. Some friendships never fade, and some bonds, like the one between a boy and his dog, last forever.